today. And I really hope that this is just a nice introduction into what we'll be spending much time talking about at AM21. The process that we've set up for this morning is to walk with each other through a PowerPoint presentation that talks about what was the context that brought us to this work, some time looking just at section 1 of the drafted manual on ministry, looking just simply at the outline of section 2, and then talking a bit more about the bridge document that's included in section 1. And there'll be times after each of those intervals for us to ask questions. I would ask, and it looks like most of you are used to using this technology, that you mute yourselves unless you're speaking, so that way we don't get any feedback. All right. Well, I'm going to do a share screen here and ask David Hill to start us with prayer as soon as I bring up that screen. There we go.
Let us come before God in a spirit of prayer, and let us pray. O Holy One, as we become an expression of your presence in our midst, we ask for your Spirit to be present in our discernment of your call in our lives. As your church gathers, guide and strengthen us in the ways we serve your name with our gifts and passions. Throughout history, you have emboldened leaders in your effort to energize people to serve creation. May we sense your Spirit moving within our efforts to raise up and support leaders for your church's ongoing work in the world. In your holy name we pray. Amen. So a little background, as you can see on your screen, we start out by taking a look at some of the prior documents, and you can see that the first manual of ministry was created back in the 1960s, and there were revisions along the way. One of the things that we noticed is with each revision, the manual got larger and larger and larger until it became this very large binder with multiple sections. Although it was not something we were tasked with, I think we did strive to make things a bit smaller going forward as one of our goals. So we were charged with completely re-envisioning the manual on ministry. So not just doing a tweak to it, but actually completely sort of rethinking it, reimagining how the manual worked, who it serves, and its purpose. If you want to go on to the next slide, Holly. You can look here and see how the Habakkuk group was formed. Invitations went out to every church, conference, seminary. A number of applications were received, and 17 representatives were selected, which includes one representative from the Disciples of Christ. It's important to note that the Habakkuk group was intentionally created to be very diverse. So there are clergy and laity, there are commissions ministers, ordained ministers, licensed ministers, members in discernment, people of color, people of different sexual orientation. It's like, in many ways, sort of a mini general synod, a very mini general synod. And it's been a wonderfully diverse group. And one of the things that I've really appreciated is the deep trust that formed within the Habakkuk members very, very rapidly in this process. Many of us are already, I think, somewhat starting to lament that when the day comes when we will not have an excuse for all gathering together in one place. So the work began a couple of years ago. We are now sort of reaching the point where we're releasing much of our work at AM21 for people to see, review, comment upon, and reflect upon. A key part of this was discernment throughout. So this has been a process of really paying attention to the key Habakkuk texts that sort of we laid out at the beginning, but listening carefully to one another and discerning where God is calling the church today and in the future.
One of the very first resources that we developed was the Discernment Travelogue, which we have shared more broadly with the United Church of Christ. But this travelogue was foundational to the work of the Habakkuk group because we knew that we wanted to be attentive to God's Spirit, and we knew that we wanted to ask the same thing of committees on ministry. And so we thought it would be helpful for us to actually develop a discernment travelogue. And so this was our first resource that this group produced, and it's now available in English, Spanish, and Samoan. And Stephen, will you talk a little bit about the landscape in which we've worked?
Right. We're using the discernment travelogue and also some of the other Mesa publications, Journaling the Journey, and working with committees. What we looked at with discernment is that we're starting to understand and beginning to get appreciation for the fact that the perspectives on ministry are changing a lot during these times. We all bring some sort of different perspective to ministry, and as the United Church of Christ is evolving and is growing into the 21st century, we want to make sure that we capture all those perspectives and that we make a welcoming church, understanding that this is the diversity that we are responsible for and that we respect as we go ahead and do ministry. So the landscape is changing. A number of different kinds of factors go into this, as you'll see on your screen. Some of this came out of, most of this information came out of CARD, which is the Center for Analytics, Research, and Data. And you'll notice what's changing is that the number of sizes of churches, the full-time ministry opportunities, notions of what membership is, confidence in institutions inside the walls, and traditional arc of ministry, and that refers to the arc of ministry of an individual clergy person. What we're seeing now, and I'm experiencing a lot in my arena, is a lot more people are going into specialized settings. We're working more with part-time and bivocational individuals. There's a less of formal affinity groups. Engagement in mission is starting to be more and more important. The individuals are looking outside the walls, and we're looking into innovative ministry, which we're starting to see is really something that poses a challenge for for our committees on ministry. So we wanted to be sure in the Habakkuk group to address this and give good information, good discernment for our committees on ministry. We know that this is going to have a real impact on as the varieties of changes start to come into our committees on ministry, and as we get an appreciation across the entire United Church of Christ. And we're going to probably feel it the most at our middle judicatories, especially at the committees on ministry, as they discern with their members in discernment and individuals going into ministry what these opportunities actually look like. And we're starting to see the shifting nature, and this is mostly acutely felt at the committees on ministry as we see some of these changes to grab hold, and our seminarians and our members in discernment taking this time to discern where God is really placing them, what kind of ministry are they really being called to. Some of the source documents that we use, you can see here. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I think what the importance of this slide shows us is that the Habakkuk group did not just work in isolation with itself and the members of that group, but we brought in all sorts of various documents and various sources. A lot of time was spent reading those, reflecting on them, discerning from them, and seeing how those documents could be important resources for us as we worked towards this new manual that we wanted to open up ministry for the 21st century.
And as David stated earlier, one of the texts from Habakkuk that has really been a driving force for our work has been the text from the 2nd chapter, 2nd verse, write the vision and make it plain. And that is create a document that is easily accessible and understandable. And so what we have done in our draft proposed document is create 3 sections. The first section is one on theological grounding, which has not been a primary tool in previous manuals on ministry. It assumes a theological grounding or makes slight reference to them, but we wanted to be able to come out of our theological understanding and have that influence the rest of the materials. So that's what section 1 includes. Section 2 is probably the most familiar feeling to the current iteration of the Manual on Ministry, which was drafted in 1986 and given some revisions in 2002. And so what section 2 is it talks about each of the covenants that we hold, our covenants with ecumenical partners, our covenants between clergy and committees on ministry, our covenants for standing, our covenants for oversight. And then section 3, we hope, is an ever expanding and ever updated place to find resources for committees on ministry. This is where the sample letters will be, where the checklists will be, where the guidelines will all be located. And we do hope that when we create the final document, and what you have in your hands is simply a draft, but when the final document comes together, that it will be available both in print and online, but it will be an integrated document that will include hyperlinks. So you could be looking at the section on ministerial oversight, be able to look back theologically to say, what is it that gives our committees on ministry the authority to do fitness reviews, and then to click forward into section 3 and find the checklist for fitness reviews. 2 particular things that are important to note. One is that while committees on ministry have done a great number of tasks over the life of the United Church of Christ, this document focuses specifically on ministerial authorization. It does not include things that could be included in a separate manual for church. So we do not get into what are marks of a faithful and effective church, how does a congregation get standing. Those we hope another group will take on at another time, and that this document is focused specifically on ministerial authorization. And we also know that many different partners will read and use this resource, but we were very clear that our primary audience were committees on ministry, and that includes both authorized and lay individuals who are on these committees. And so we tried to really make it plain and not be too obtuse in our language. We weren't trying to write towards strictly, say, a mid-mentor. We were writing to the Committee on Ministry about how to engage a mid-mentor, for example. And so that's our primary audience. I'm going to pause here and see if folks have any sort of questions on the big overview that we just went over. Seeing none, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about section 1. So, Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you. Section 1 is our theological grounding, and it's meant to cover covenantal polity, theology of authorized ministry, the marks of faithful and effective authorized ministers, and the ministry of the Committee on Ministry itself. And so it kind of covers the undergirding of all of the work that we're doing. Theologically, we affirmed very early on our covenant theology and the commitment that God makes to God's people. And so it was important for us to understand our response to God's call and the relationship that happens when God calls us and we respond. And then when we respond to work with other people and care about other people, that covenant continues. Certainly at the heart of UCC, polity and governance, to be the body of Christ together, all parts of the same. We all know about that. The other piece that was really, really important to us, and we kept going back to make sure that we highlighted well, was this understanding of the priesthood of all believers, that we really understand that God calls every minister, everyone into ministry of some sort. And so as we use the discernment tool, the travelogue, and some other things, really trying to help everyone understand what it is that God is calling them to do. So in the midst of that, knowing that everyone is called to some kind of ministry, we discerned that folks who are authorized to do a particular ministry in the United Church of Christ would be ordained folks. And we expanded our vision for ordination quite broadly, trying to, and kind of talk about this in understanding of an ordainable call, that someone who is ordained is doing sacraments, so baptism and communion, and we felt that ordination was the only authorization that was necessary in the United Church of Christ. And so the expanded vision of ordination is about how do we have folks that have in the past perhaps been licensed or commissioned work toward a process that might bring them to ordination. And we've had lots of conversations around that, and we'll have some time to continue that conversation. In the past, perhaps we've had churches that are part-time churches, part-time churches that have part-time pastors license a minister to serve them. And we felt very strongly if someone is called to do that ministry, that is the same thing. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how to talk about this other than I know Marty Balmer talked about the 20-year process of trying to figure out what's the difference between licensed ministry and ordained ministry, and we haven't solved that. And so it occurred to us that perhaps ordination is really the authorization that we need to move forward with. Now, we also know that some churches in a period of time may not be able to have an ordained person serve them. And our member in discernment pool of folks might have the possibility of having a limited standing to serve a local church and to be to have oversight over them. So a fitness review would be possible. Right now with members in discernment, that's not an option because they don't have standing per se. So the possibility of limited standing with a member in discernment who would go and serve a church for part of their time of their training, their preparation, their formation. It would be a limited thing, not an ongoing forever thing, 1 year at a time, and have the possibility of serving some of our churches as needed in that way. The marks we've already been using. We have revised them and put them into 8 categories, and I'm really excited about our revising these marks in a way that I think will be usable. We, by having 8 categories, we have an opportunity to really focus on those 8 areas with particular competencies under each one. The marks have been set up with a tool that will help you assess each one. And so there's a assessment tool that says for a particular mark, this person might do such and such and such and such. That will help you to understand how to assess it. It's very exciting. I think we've done some good work in that area, and we'll continue to use the marks as the basis for assessing whether a member in discernment is ready for ordination. Let's see. I think that's it for me. That's really brief. Can't hear you, David. You're muted, David.
Thank you, Cheryl. So a big focus for us was committees on ministry, because this is really where the rubber hits the road. So as we thought about the resources that we are creating, we're really thinking in terms of how do we make this accessible to committees on ministry? How do we create resources that are helpful to the important work that they do? Recognizing that committees on ministries are a container for local practices. They are also a point of intersection for all settings of the church. And that decisions that are made there are in and on behalf of the whole United Church of Christ. And I think very significantly, we spent some time recognizing that service on a committee on ministry is ministry in and of itself. And so there are some resources we've created for comms to help them think about what sort of gifts do you really need to have around the table at your committee on ministry? What makes for an effective committee on ministry? what are some of the best practices for a committee on ministry. But above all, making sure that this resource is something that is readily accessible and easily usable by committee on ministries. So if we, so if we're looking at, so picking up on that, you can see how what we've talked about, we have ministerial authorization, standing, oversight, and this is just sort of showing one way of how this, how it all breaks out to help people understand how everything relates together within a committee on ministry and their various areas of responsibility.
So as Holly stated before, Section 2 becomes that part of this new publication which will seem to be the most familiar. And the structure of that, Holly, we can go to the next slide. The structure of Section 2 is broken down into these 5 different sections. Members in discernment, ecumenically ordained ministers, ministerial standing, covenants and endorsements of ordained ministers, and accountability and support for ordained ministers. And the crux of this section gets into it takes from Section 1, the theology of covenant, and brings it then into this section to show how foundationally we've used the covenantal theology and how it works in all these various places where the committees on ministry have responsibility. So this becomes an explanation of some of these very important things that we do in committees on ministry, and how we would like the committees to look at when they look at their members in discernment, and how to help them to discern. Or when we get down to covenants and endorsements, what is it that the endorsement office is really looking for when we're starting to look at somebody for, say, example, Veterans Administration chaplaincy or a chaplaincy in the military. So these different sections give the committees on ministry an opportunity to see the thought process of what the Habakkuk group has really felt as foundational as they go about this work in committee. What will be important, obviously, to the committees is not only this foundational material, but also that there will be, as Holly was mentioning, the ability then to move from Section 2 into Section 3, where you have the real nuts and bolts of how the different processes are seen to be taking place. For example, a checklist for an endorsement for Veterans Administration chaplaincy, or what we expect of our members in discernment. So all of that is kind of taken out of this and not embedded in this Section 2, but it's in the Section 3, we have the supporting documents that show how this work in Section 2 is actually done by the committee. So kind of looking at that, are there any questions that anybody might have at this point in the presentation as we're trying to show you how we have moved through this process?
This is Sherry. So I'm backing up a little bit here. So again, what you're proposing in this manual on ministry is that licensure and commissioning no longer will be options, that it's all about ordination.
Correct.
I thought I heard somewhere in many conversations about this along the way that the commissioning part had been reconsidered and was being added back in.
No, what you'll see in the bridge document is that, and throughout this piece, is that because of our belief in the priesthood of all believers, when we actually look across the life of the United Church of Christ, we have thousands of people who are commissioned, but we only have 125 of them who are commissioned through a committee on ministry. So, for example, all of our global ministries staff receive a commissioning, those who are working overseas on our behalf, and that commissioning and relationship comes directly with the relationship with the global ministries and wider church ministries, but not a one, to my knowledge, is actually commissioned through a committee on ministry. And so we have inconsistency across the life of the church on how that's used. So out of the current 125 And that number has decreased every single year. So less than 1% are currently commissioned through a committee on ministry. 25 of those are already retired. And one of the things that we clarified in conversation with conference staff was that commissioning would last through the current call. And so somebody could, if they're already serving in a location, they could retire or stay in that location for a length of time. But if they're going to move locations, that's where we would encourage either local commissioning or a conversation about, is this work that you're doing truly representative of the United Church of Christ and the Church Universal? And therefore, can we have a conversation about ordination?
Holly, one of the things that I think maybe is important to talk about, I know Habakkuk, we talked a lot about the culture of call in each local congregation and really hopefully helping our local congregations to think about how everybody is called to some kind of ministry. Mm-hmm. I think that's important to kind of highlight.
Yeah.
This is Rich. A question, curiosity question, I guess. I'm wondering to what extent, if any, has ecumenical considerations played a role in the categories of authorization that we are considering here?
I can definitely handle that question because that is my bailiwick right now. I sit on many ecumenical groups, one of which is Churches Uniting in Christ, and we had, which is the outgrowth of COCU, and I went to their annual meeting, and we had a separate day just for those who do this sort of ministerial authorization staff. And I want to say out of the 12 communions represented, 8 of which are revising their categories for ministerial authorization. And so ordination remains the mainstay of all Protestant and Catholic communions as the shared language. For example, the Disciples of Christ moved 2 years ago from 3 forms of authorization to 2 forms of authorization, and we learned a lot from their process. And we are concurrently recommending our changes while the United Church of Canada is also moving to, they call it one order of ministry. So they're also making that recommendation. So we have been phenomenally engaged in the sort of wider ecumenical world. And we realize that while these things feel deeply, they deeply impact our individual work, that this is part of the larger systemic trends of mainline Christianity, that folks are looking at what are these different roles and how do we maintain these large structures that were built in time periods with much more capacity than institutions currently have. Great question.
I would like to offer a thought and a question around this. And I'm thinking of it in terms of the number of people who have difficulty being ordained because they don't have a call that qualifies them for ordination, or a call from a church that can afford a salary that meets our requirements for ordination. So my question is, in going to this as the only officially recognized, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would end up with this being the only official affirmation of the denomination of one's calling to ministry. Is there going to be consideration given to the requirements for ordination? Because otherwise, you have many people out here who have completed seminary degrees and who are not serving because they aren't being called to the very real situation of churches diminishing capacity to call ministers, especially churches diminishing request for the progressive ministers that are finishing seminary right now. So my concern is for the individuals who feel very clearly from God, which is the first part of this covenant, that they've been called to ministry and now would be without any type of affirmation from the church.
Mm-hmm. I think I can say a little bit more about our expanded understanding of ordination and ordainable call, the sense in which we're going to ask committees on ministry to consider folks their call not necessarily to be one that's a full-time or paid lots of money or any money, maybe $1. I'm not sure how we set up at that, but I mean, to really say it's a call to ministry or to be ordained doesn't necessarily mean you're paid a salary or work a certain number of hours. It has more to do with the type of work that you're doing. And so if you look on page 74 in the manual that was just sent out, we want to make sure it's covenantal, it responds to the needs of the church. And I think that's what you're talking about, Tracy, is that if the church needs this ministry, then we need to ordain somebody to it. And it isn't about what the salary is or the number of hours.
I am speaking to that, but I'm speaking a little larger than that.
Okay.
I'm saying that if we're only going to have ordained ministry, yes, up front and foremost is the salary portion, because that is an issue with some people. The progressiveness of ministers graduating is also an issue with some of the churches. My question is, are we going to expand ordination beyond the church walls? So it may not be an ordination that's needed within the physical structure or infrastructure of church as we know it, but are we opening up venues for people to be ordained to the public square? Can someone be ordained to prison ministry?
Yes, absolutely.
Tracy,
absolutely.
Working in the environment that I'm working in right now, I'm working with a lot of committees on ministry to do just that. We are starting to work very intentionally to work beyond the local church walls to envision what ordained ministry looks like when out in the public square. So this is something that we're already doing, and committee of ministry by committee on ministry, we're working through some of these very interesting calls that by the time we work with giving them 3, 4, 5-way covenants, showing how this ministry is authorizable, that indeed the committees on ministry have no problem ordaining them into these different ministries that are in specialized settings.
I think just to add to that, in the Western Reserve Association, we are having those conversations. I just finished 7 years on the Committee on Ministry working in discernment of call. We're already having those conversations. They are challenging not because we don't want to ordain people to things outside of the church. It's the very thing that Stephen just talked about. It's figuring out the accountability and covenant pieces so that we can be responsible about that. The other thing that you mentioned with the salary, at least within the Ohio Conference, there are guidelines, but they don't force churches. Churches can do whatever they want, but that's also been a concern of ours with moving into this other model, is that we have felt that there have been folks who have been licensed to ministry because churches are taking advantage of that and not compensating people fairly because they're a licensed minister. And so we've ended up with sort of a two-tier system where ordained is one sort of compensation, licensure is different, and yet people are doing the same kind of work. And so that was another part of our process, was how do we correct this so that churches can be responsible and just about their compensation of the people that are serving them.
Are there any other reflections or conversation that are coming out of this section 2 that we need to lift?
This is Pam. I have a question about how all of this relates to the alternative paths to ordination and the educational components and expectations.
Pam, I think that we're continuing to really look at the marks as a foundational piece that each committee on ministry would have the member in discernment do an assessment of their qualifications on the marks, to have the committee do that, to have perhaps seminary, perhaps a class that would write a letter. We really have worked on making sure that there's ways to assess each of those marks. But I think it works directly into the multiple paths. So a seminary degree would help you meet those marks, perhaps. Life experience could help you meet those marks. Mentoring could help you meet the marks. All of those different ways of doing that. Does that answer your question, or?
I think so, at least for the moment.
We'll live into it, yes. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so this is not a new question. I know this has been raised by others. That I think in our conversations here in the upper Midwest, and I'll speak specifically about my staff here in Iowa, we work with an awful. I mean, our conference is a conference of tiny little churches, and we've got churches, that are worshiping 12 people, and they're going to have a very, very, very part-time minister. And frankly, the search and call system is utterly irrelevant in that situation. And so everything is ad hoc about that. And we struggle with the question of a relationship between the wider church and the very part-time pastors of these little tiny churches that sometimes come to us with absolutely no UCC background at all. And these are not the kinds of situations where we've got people who are looking to take churches out of the UCC. That isn't even a part of the conversation here. But these are not folk who are likely candidates for being mids. And we're struggling to figure out, how do we have a formal relationship of some accountability with these folks? And I'm sitting here thinking, might there be such a thing as conference authorization? I'm curious what the Habakkuk group, what the deliberations were about these kinds of situations.
Yeah, Rich, I can speak to that in part. I absolutely hear you in the deficiency of the search and call process for our extremely small, generally rural congregations. And I do hope that there are ways in which we can uplift those ministries to the best of their capacity. And I think that was really the hope of the Habakkuk group in our conversations, were repeatedly around what are the needs of the church. And obviously, as we look back on this last week and we look at the presidential elections and the need to have even our smallest congregations engage in deep and meaningful conversations around values, we want the best for those who are serving those congregations. And what has been happening, not with any intentionality, but we have sort of given a pass in many places, not all places, to the ongoing formation of those who are licensed to serve those smaller congregations, that we've only asked the minimum of them. And what the Habakkuk group has talked about is that the church needs excellent ministers, regardless of the size of the worshiping congregation. And so we did envision that somebody would be part of a member in discernment process so that they're continuing to gain and learn their skills. And that may end up just being for a season for a particular congregation and then end. Or it may lead to something longer and more sustaining, like ordained ministry in multiple small locations. And so we realized that this is a question of viability of some of our small congregations, as we happen to be in the life cycle span of particularly some of our smaller and rural churches, but that what we want to ensure is that every congregation has the best possible ministerial leadership that the United Church of Christ can support.
So I appreciate that and I agree with that, Holly. I think you know that I would.
Yeah.
And the piece of conversation that I want to have maybe is better reserved for San Antonio, and I can happily wait till then to have an opportunity to have a more nuanced conversation. But I have a little bit of concern about unintended consequences, the chief of which might be an increasing unintended but real kind of sorting, whereby our very small, rural, and therefore more traditional / conservative congregations continue to leave us because they feel like if their minister can't be authorized. We struggle with this because on the one hand, my staff and I and our board of directors want to raise the level of identification with the core values of the United Church of Christ. And we say to ourselves, so what if we asked our congregations, now we're not exactly talking about authorized ministry, but I get back to this in a second here. If we asked our congregations to recovenant on the basis of the core values that are being most recently promulgated by the United Church of Christ Board, we suspect we would have a conference that doesn't have 168 churches. It would have at most 100 churches, maybe not even 100 churches. And we say to ourselves, would that be a good or a bad thing? Well, on the whole, we think it would be a good thing except for one thing, and that it would make us decidedly less rural, because those churches that would leave us are rural churches. And so I'm very torn about whether we're thinking really hard and carefully about some of the potential consequences. And maybe I'll leave that there, and then we can have this conversation at greater length at a time that's a little easier to do so.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Rick, and Rich, and I wrote down several of those thoughts to follow up on. Well, at this moment, I'm going to invite us into additional conversation. One of the things that we realized that as we were creating the drafts of Section 1 and Section 2, that the most logical response would be, so how do we do this? And so we've created a bridge document, and it is simply a potential way for conferences and committees on ministries to engage these conversations. One of the things that we learned in the month of October was not to put dates in here. So all dates have been removed in the version that you have now received in the mail, because really there is no sort of adoption deadline for any of this material. This is a time for us to be in conversation with the wider church around our deeper questions around ministerial authorization. But we did want to provide some guidelines if places throughout the UCC wanted to start to engage these conversations. So I wanted to talk about the deep affirmation for those who have currently been serving in licensed and commissioned ministry. It is a small but deeply important part of the United Church of Christ. And so if you look at our most recent statistical profile, we have just under 10,000 ordained ministers. We have 664 licensed ministers. Of those licensed ministers, over 100 of them are already members in discernment. And so they're already in that place that we would be recommending about a member in discernment with limited standing so that they could serve in a congregational context. And as I said earlier in response to Sherry's very good question, we currently have 126 people commissioned for ministry, and out of those, already 25 of them are listed as retired commissioned ministers. So that is less than 1% of our overall authorized ministers in the United Church of Christ.
Can I ask a quick question on that chart?
Absolutely.
So isn't that kind of misleading in that it includes the retirees, and once a licensed pastor is retired, they lose their license? So it's set up that there would be a lot more ordained ministers, and the percentages might not really be a fair representation of what we're looking at.
Since 2007, licensed ministers can have retired status.
Okay.
And so it is true that we absolutely have more retired ordained ministers than we do have retired licensed ministers. So when we look at this still statistically, out of our active ordained ministers, you can see down in the bottom of the chart, we have over 6,000. And that number down here does not include the retired ministers.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Great questions. And you can see too, we've got 316 people with dual standing and 138 people with ordained ministerial partner standing, which right now is just with the disciples of Christ. What we're talking about here is to ask those who are currently licensed or commissioned just to gather and to have a just general conversation around the materials that have been produced. No decisions to be made, but we realize that this can be a time of high anxiety, both for judicatories, for congregations, and for those who are authorized. And so it's important just simply to have these sort of open-ended times of conversation and exploration. We hope that they're filled with the sense of the Holy Spirit and of prayer. But what we're asking is for the church to engage deeply in these conversations. There may be a second meeting then where there can be some conversation once people have had a chance to digest and think about the materials and not come out of a reactive space, but come out of a space of true discernment, thinking about what is the call that God has been placed on my life, and do I envision the ministry in which I am serving, and does the Committee on Ministry see that as representative of both the United Church of Christ and the Church Universal? And if so, does that mean that we should be looking at a path of preparation that could lead to ordination? One of the other sort of nuances that we currently experience in our system is that we have more and more of our licensed ministers who are serving multiple congregations. I think previously we had an assumption that licensed ministers would be called up from within a congregation, serve that congregation, and then be done. But that's not the case. We have licensed ministers who are serving 3-4 different calls and are looking for portability. And then we really have to ask the question, what is the difference between licensed and ordained if the ministry is portable, which has been one of the sort of lines that we have drawn historically. And so to ask the conversation, is this a ministry that is reflective of both our denomination and the Church Universal? And if so, can the Committee on Ministry sit down with the marks and look at the ministry experience of that individual and put together a plan of formation? Or if no, is there a way that we can really celebrate the priesthood of all believers and say that lay leadership is a phenomenal gift to the church from God, and that we would like to locally celebrate, but that the ministry may not be one that requires authorization in and on behalf of the entire denomination? And so we've included in Section 3 liturgies for local commissioning, which happens actually on a pretty regular basis, but to be able to have some of those conversations about how do we not devalue the priesthood of all believers and the gifts that lay ministry brings to the United Church of Christ. We have got another spot for conversation at this point. Reflections pretty much on anything that we've talked about so far?
Holly, I'm wondering about that local commissioning for lay ministry. What does that do with sacraments?
Sacraments, we tend to think as something that receives authorization from the church for sacraments. And so historically for us in the United Church of Christ, commissioning has not been a sacramental authorization. And I would assume as much in a local context as well.
I really appreciate the that emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and the raising up of all members as ministers and claiming that as part of a whole life vocation. It, in many ways, is something that our churches have not addressed well. And so I'm trying to think of ways in which we prepare our congregations, particularly our small congregations and our large congregations, to actually engage in that kind of membership formation. The entry points that are going to be required to do this whole, in many ways, this whole mental, spiritual kind of change.
Yeah, I'm thinking this is going to be a great opportunity for our churches to really look at their spiritual life and the formation of ministers. If we are all ministers, then what does that mean? We're not just a social club. We really are creating disciples. And so I think this is at least the opportunity to create something very exciting for the church.
I agree, but we've got to get a lot of people on board with making that a universal appeal.
This is also a question of curiosity. I'm wondering what discussion you had with our seminary partners along the way and whether or not they've weighed in on this.
Yeah, I can take that. We do have seminary representatives within the Habakkuk group, and we've got several seminary representatives in our group of readers along the way for the last 2 years. Every time we finished a piece of our work, we would send it out to our 25 readers and receive feedback. And in the same way that conference staff have been engaged at this moment, there is an invitation for seminary presidents and deans to be at AM21 this year. So it's been an ongoing feedback loop and not just seminaries, but seminaries in particular is the one you've lifted up in your question.
Yeah, and of course the reason I'm asking that is because I could see how this might appear, I don't know if threatening is the right word exactly, but as someone who serves on one of our seminary's board of trustees and being very familiar with the growing challenge of compelling people who feel called to take the path that includes seminary, I mean, that challenge already existed, and now given what this manual on ministry revision is suggesting, you know, that could accelerate that reality. I'm not sure. We don't know that, but I just wonder where the seminaries are at on this.
Yeah, I sit on the Council for Theological Education. I know Rich was there at this last meeting. And I think it's true of all 6 of our UCC seminaries that they have been living into the reality of the ministry issues pronouncement for the last 10 years. And that all seminaries, regardless of denominational affiliation, have been challenged with their full-time student load, particularly within the Masters of Divinity program. But that each of the seminaries, including our own 6, are looking at ways in which to do continued enrichment. And so, for example, the opportunity of somebody who's currently licensed to take particular courses in a seminary without being enrolled in a full-time degree program will still benefit the seminary in ways in which they're looking to continue to do not just the academic degree, but the enrichment of faith leaders in the church. So I actually think there's some pretty creative ways in which our seminaries can be engaged particularly in the formation of the plan of formation for individuals. I think there's some real possibilities and potential here.
Thank you.
I'm enthused for this document and have some good expectations for how our Church and Ministry Committee here in Montana and Northern Wyoming will work with this and become a more discerning group. As I read through it, the question I had was about the local church's involvement in the initial part of the mid process of identifying those among its membership and working with those to recommend them into a mid process. There seems to be very little direction there, and I understand we don't have a document on church yet, and I would look forward to that happening as soon as possible. This is very middle judicatory oriented. I think I need some assistance working with the local churches, and along the line that Rich was referring to, is helping create that sense of covenant and ownership of the ordination process and mid-process.
Mark, one of the things that we've done in section 3 is kind of create a best practices, different documents and best practices, and the local church discernment committee that would work with an MID. I think we've got some good ideas about how to do that. Now, I think what you're talking about is even before you get to that point. But I really am hoping that this section 3 will help us create resources and best practices across the church that we can share with each other. I think right now we don't have that mechanism to do that, where this section 3 will be a work, kind of a document that's constantly being updated and shared in a way that will be helpful to folks. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Hi, this is Campbell. I've got a question. One, I appreciate the effort that's gone into this, and I really appreciate the size of the manual on ministry, and I'm excited about the resource section that will have some links as needed. I keep wondering about the role of the marks and the different expectations we have for how they're developed and how they're going to be used. The language in the manual, it talks about how committees on ministry will be guided in their work by the marks. There's also language that will ensure growth in ministry according to the marks, so a little more prescriptive. And then even in the fitness review piece, that we're encouraged to use the marks in creating the program of growth. I just would be interested in hearing more about how local churches were involved in creating the marks. If they have a role in identifying people who may have gifts for ordained ministry in their midst. Have laity in local churches had a big role in identifying the marks? And how do we continue to work with the marks, which now are very much a part of all our work, the way there's no more statement of ministry in the profile, but it's all essays regarding the marks. And just thinking out loud, how will that change now that the marks have been simplified and clarified in the candidates' profiles? But just some more reflection about the marks and their ongoing influence in the manual on ministry and the candidates' profiles and local churches raising up folk for ordained ministry.
We're all waiting for somebody else to respond. I I know that we looked at some of the work that CARD did and some other places in terms of research on the types of characteristics that lead to effective ministry. And so that was an early on piece, and I think the whole church was invited to that resource, that evaluation of ministry. I also, just on my own, I've done some work on looking at the seminary question a little bit, and the types of seminary classes that would cover each of the marks. So that it certainly seems to be representative of all of that. You asked a lot of questions, Campbell. Now my brain isn't going to keep them all in there, but say again, focus one question for me.
But just the way the new manual, or the suggested manual, is, it talks about using the marks as a guide.
Yeah.
Then it also has pieces about, according to the marks, or ensuring growth according to, or using the marks. So are the marks a guide, or are they written in stone? I'm just, we've used the journaling the marks with our members in discernment, and that's a helpful reflection tool. But certainly we're not using the marks as, the definitive and only competencies for ministry. So it's more of a question for ongoing reflection as we grow into the marks. Are there going to be alternatives to the marks as well?
I think that's helpful. I know that we were concerned about when you're talking about like fitness reviews or ethics in ministry, that somehow all of this fit together in some way, that we're not talking about one set of criteria in one place and a different set of criteria in another place. And so I think we've tried to make it a little bit seamless in that way, but I'm sure we're all really open to more conversation about that and how that really works. I think that the 8 categories we came up with, we felt like were pretty exhaustive, maybe not exhaustive, but representative of what would make effective ministry. I'm certainly open, and I'm sure everyone is, to hearing other things that we may have missed, or emphasis that we put in there that aren't as helpful. I think the main thing I would say is that we've really tried to make the marks something that is woven throughout ordained ministers and authorized ministers' life, so that continuing education might happen in an area where there's some weakness or growth needed. That if you're in a fitness review and there's an area of the marks that really speak to the weakness of that particular pastor, we can use that as a tool to help do some improvement, some skill building. So I think you're seeing it right. Whether we as a church decide that's the best way to go or not is part of the conversation, but I think you are seeing that correctly.
So am I also hearing that there will no longer be a code of ethics for authorized ministers and a code of ethics for the local church in relationship to its pastor?
There will still be go ahead, Holly, you take it.
The code has been one of my pet projects within this work, and you'll see in the standing section that we have revised the ministerial code, and that was one of our sort of ongoing questions as the group discerned its work was, do we need a separate code as different from the marks? And we said yes, because the marks are developmental, and the code gives us a bottom line by which to judge fitness for ministry. And so we really worked very hard looking at the ministerial code and saying, is this reflective of the reasons for which we currently see our fitness reviews? And is this reflective of the professional capacity that we expect of our ministers. So I do think that's, for me personally, one of the resources that I'm excited about testing more broadly.
Okay. We haven't gotten ours copies here in Vermont yet, so we're waiting for the post office to catch up with us.
Yeah.
I wanted to respond to Campbell's comments about the use of the marks, because they're now also called for in the new local church profile and are referred to. So I think there's a big need to get our congregations, both for the culture of call, as well as working with their members in discernment, as well as working with a local church profile, to get the local churches on board with those marks. And in the absence of marks of faithful and effective churches, one of our, well, first of all, we do ask our local church discernment committees to work through the journal with the members in discernment, so that that committees also becoming aware of the marks as the student is journaling, and they have conversations about those areas. But as I shared with Holly last week, one of our interim pastors is thinking about using the marks as part of the search process for a self-reflection on who we are as a church, how faithful and effective are we, as a way of becoming familiar with them, but also for getting a self-portrait.
Holly, can you tell us what page that revised code of ethics is on in the draft here?
69. It's 69.
Thank you.
Well, I'm hoping that this time together has piqued your interest and that it helps to prime the pump for our conversations in San Antonio, Texas. I think the model of questions and dialogue here has just been phenomenal. I really appreciate your time. And I hope that we have the same sense of exploration and openness together at AM21. We know that our middle judicatories and those who will be gathered in Texas in 2 weeks are some of the primary stakeholders in this work. And we really hope that it's a time of prayerful conversation, a way for us to collect a whole lot of feedback and to continue to improve this so that it truly does reflect the needs of the church. We are obviously all still looking forward to any additional feedback you have, and there's a feedback sheet that will be in your packet, and also throughout AM21 there'll be intentional moments of written feedback so that we can continue to work on honing this, plus having conversations in both plenary and workshops. Are there any questions about what to expect at AM21? Okay. Well, with that, again, a deep appreciation for making the extra time today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Holly, for all your work.
Absolutely. Blessings.
See you, Holly.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Holly. Thanks.
Absolutely, Steve. Glad you joined us.